as I said just now, that it is going to be a series of lectures on theory, on different aspects of theory. We began our discussion with the phenomenology, and after that we started discussing structuralism. My effort has been to present before you the complexity of the subject and also the vastness of the subject. Since structuralism is the starting point in most discussions of contemporary literary theory, so it is fit that we understand structuralism, all its aspects, the entire complexity of this subject, and also criticism of this important school. How did I begin talking about structuralism? In just 2-3 minutes, I'll just give you a kind of summing up of what we have done in the last 4-5 lectures. We trace the history of structuralism. We trace the history of structuralist ideas, and that took us to the discussion of Vico. Vico was an 18th century Italian thinker. He wrote a book which became very popular even after his death. That book was Physics of Man. Sorry, the new science. And he talked about physics of man in that book. So I have already talked about this. What you can do is you can also look at the notes which I have posted on your WhatsApp page. And these notes are important because basically these notes are points which help me organize this entire series. And there are also sources from where I have taken some ideas. So Terry Gilten is one important source. There is a very important chapter on structuralism in Terry Gilten's book. But I'll say that Terry Gilten talks about criticism of the concept structuralism in a much more convincing manner. This is my idea. Then possibly he explains the concept of structuralism. We'll come to that point also. There are other very good accounts of structuralism. If you are interested in a very comprehensive discussion of structuralism, then there is a book in New Accent series, and that book is simply titled Structuralism and Semiotics. It is by Terence Hawkes. And of course, there are other important authorities on structuralism. One such authority is Robert Coles, S-C-H-O-L-E-S. S-C-H-O-L-E-S, Robert Coles. It is pronounced as Coles. It may appear Scholes, but actually it is pronounced as Coles. Robert Coles has written 3 important books on structuralism. One which heralded structuralism, especially structuralism's relationship to literature. This is an old book. It came out in 1974, and this book is simply titled Structuralism in Literature. Then he wrote another book. That book is about semiotics, another related methodology, semiotics and interpretation. It is a kind of companion volume to structuralism in literature. And there is yet another important book, which is simply titled Textual Power. So basically, some of the ideas which you see in these notes, they are taken from many of these sources. And of course, there are some other works also. One basic book, one basic textbook, which is very popular with theory students, and it has been very popular. It is by Raman Selden, A Reader's Guide to Contemporary Literary Theory. Maybe I'll talk about these sources. I'll post these sources in your WhatsApp page. So what I'm saying is that the notes that you see here, they are taken from my reading of these sources and also from my own understanding of the subject. I've tried to simplify them. So if you see these notes, you'll have a fair idea of the journey of structuralism as a concept and also its different ramifications and how it grew further and further. So coming back to this idea of structuralism, we talked about history, we talked about Vico, and then we talked about the definition of structuralism. And for definition, there is a very important book, and that book is simply titled Structuralism, and which is written by Jean Piaget. And Jean Piaget also talked about structuralism with reference to many other important fields, like for example, fields in sciences, biology, mathematics, and so on, and in social sciences. So that gives you an idea about the complexity of this subject, that structuralism is a subject which is not simply about literature, but it is relevant to many other fields also, especially sciences, social sciences, and maybe you can also say that many other fields which are not mentioned in Piaget's book. So the complexity and the vastness of the subject, and it is better to say that structuralism can be discussed in plural terms, structuralism or structuralist responses to the world. We also discussed a little bit about structuralism as a movement of mind and structuralism as a method. So when we discuss structuralism as a movement of mind, we are talking about structuralist response to the world. And there Vico is important, and Jean Piaget is also important. And there how structuralism appeared at a particular point of time and the context in which it appeared, that is also very important. And what was that context? The context was the fragmentary nature of knowledge when structuralism appeared. So structuralism tried to unify knowledge. Structuralism tried to see knowledge in terms of relationships or different objects which otherwise are considered independent. So those independently existing objects are not independent. That is one important insight of structuralism, but rather those independently existing objects have some kind of relationship. So it is this relationship which structuralism tries to explore. Now, if we think about structuralism, then we can further say that structuralism is also a very important method of scholarship. That means it is also a very important methodology, right? So you can just see your notes, and meanwhile I can have a sip. Right. So structuralism as a movement of mind and structuralism as a method of inquiry. So this later concept, structuralism as method of inquiry, is important for students of literature. Why? Because here we are talking about application of structuralism to literature. And we'll see later that how there are some very important sub-schools within structuralism which talk about application of structuralism to works of literature. That is a whole field, and especially that field is relevant to the study of fiction. So we will come to that point a bit later. Now, who is the founding father of structuralism? Who is the most important source behind structuralism? Who is the most powerful, say, influence behind structuralism? And obviously, this person is Ferdinand de Saussure. Most of you have heard the name of Ferdinand de Saussure. Yesterday, we talked about the ideas of Ferdinand de Saussure. And you know that Ferdinand de Saussure was writing, say, in the first decade of the 20th century. He died in 1911. What was important in his theory? That he talked about language, and he talked about certain concepts which say suggest that he is a structuralist thinker. We have already discussed those concepts, and possibly you can see a discussion of all those concepts in different works. So I'm not going to talk about those concepts again, but rather you can look at the notes, and you can also see the lecture, yesterday's lecture. I'll post these lectures so you can probably listen to these lectures, and if there are still some points which need clarification, you can always raise those questions, through your text messages, and maybe I'll take care of all those questions later. I'll try to. So here we are, and we discussed Ferdinand de Saussure. I must mention another very interesting observation which was made by Terry Eagleton about structuralism. But yesterday we also, I'll come to that observation a bit later. But if I just see these notes, what I discussed yesterday, right? Yes, we were discussing about something about the appearance of structuralism on the literary scene, and it happened in 1960s. We briefly mentioned the work of another important literary theorist whose work appeared almost at the same time, a bit earlier, and that is Northrop Frye. Northrop Frye was writing in 1950s, and especially his most important book, Anatomy of Criticism, appeared in 1957. So there we are, Northrop Frye, and Northrop Frye tried to find a grammar of literature which could probably explain, or which could explain all works of literature. So this was a very ambitious plan, and we discussed this aspect also. Yesterday we were discussing a particular point. The point was that structuralism had an impact on Russian formalism, and structuralism also had impact, say, on some other, say, schools. And there we also made this point that certain ideas were developed in the United States of America. They are considered structuralist ideas about language, and they were developed there independently. It happens so often that a certain idea is developed in two different places, often independently. So when these ideas were developed in United States of America, they are also one very important current in structuralism. And if you see your notes, then you can see that there are three varieties of linguistic study. Three varieties of linguistic study that we were discussing yesterday, and we discussed two of them. So what are those three varieties of linguistic study? One is descriptive linguistics, and one is glossomatic linguistics, and the third is functional linguistics. So descriptive linguistics, it is identified with American structural linguists. And who are those American structural linguists? Sapir, Bloomfield, and of course Worf. They were studying those Indian languages. They were studying patterns in many of those Indian languages, and by Indian I mean here the original inhabitants of the United States of America. That means those Indian tribes. Those languages feared extinction, and so they needed to be preserved. So in the United States of America, the study of languages was a very important effort. And so here two disciplines meet. One is anthropology and the other is linguistics. Anthropology and linguistics. And we made this point that these linguists were surprised by a particular phenomenon. And what was that? That they found that those native Indians were not able to make certain sounds if those sounds or if patterns of those sounds were not available in their own mother tongue, right? So obviously here there is an important point. It also is there in Ferdinand de Saussure, that the point that we discussed yesterday, where we talk about some sounds and some sounds which are recognized as different in a language and they distribute meaning, and some sounds which are different but they are not recognized as different, and so they do not distribute meaning in language. This is an important point, and we made this point yesterday. So the other important say school was Copenhagen school, and we are not going to discuss that school in great detail, but just I wanted to mention this. And the third school which is important. The third school was Prague School and its functional linguistics. Prague School. Prague is in Czechoslovakia. And it was represented by Roman Jakobson. This is an important name, Roman Jakobson. And of course, there were others also. Say Mukravsky was also there. There are some names which are tongue twisters, but Roman Jakobson's name is simpler to pronounce. So for Prague School, structuralism was their war cry, battle cry. It was considered very important. And some Prague linguists, they also were critical of some features of Russian formalism, or rather they offered a critical view of Russian formalism, saying that Russian formalism was not so formal that it did not always exclude context. So this brings us to another important question. And what is that important question? See, what exactly is structuralist method? And here I can possibly go back to a very funny account of structuralism by Terry Eagleton. And what is that funny account of structuralism? Let us just talk about that. Terry Gilten narrates a story, and he himself agrees that this story is not a great piece of literature. Rather, it is a very bad kind of story. And what is that story? He says that there is a boy and there is his father. They live in a house with other family members. One day, the son, that is this boy, he is angry with something and he leaves home. When he leaves home, he goes to the forest area, and there is a dungeon there, a pit there, a well there. He falls in that pit. When father discovers that his son is not there at home, father is worried. Father looks for his son, and then father tries to follow that track, and father also goes to that forest area, and he sees that his son is there in that pit, in that well, and father pulls him out, and they both come back home happy. Very terrible kind of a story, but Terry Gilten says that this story can explain a point or two about structuralist method. And what is that? He says that suppose this story is interpreted and analyzed by a humanist critic, by a liberal humanist critic, let us say, then in that liberal humanist school, the critic will try to talk about relationships, human relationships. It is important that what are the problems which are involved in human relations, how people can possibly become angry, how they can become sad, and how family is important, and how say happiness is important. That means all these human concerns will become important, and they can further probe this question that okay, father is very loving man by temperament, and son is a bit temperamental by temperament. He can get angry, he can get sad, he can get upset. Father is very caring. That means this humanist reading of this story will see all possible meanings in human terms. And this was the kind of criticism which was practiced by most critics, and this is still practiced. On the other hand, if the critic is inspired by Freudian ideas, the critic will look for the traces of Oedipal relationship in that story. Father and son, a kind of Oedipal relationship, psychological angle, right? So this is a very different kind of interpretation. Yet another critic, and maybe this critic is inspired by deconstruction that we will discuss later. And there possibly some kind of word play may become important. I forgot to mention one detail that when sun went to the forest area, it was dark at that time. And so because of that darkness, he fell into that pit. And when father went to look for his son, at that time it was daytime and the sun was out. So father was able to see his son in that sunlight, and he was able to pull his son out from that pit. So sun, or coming out of sun, and darkness, they are also important components in this story. So a critic who is inspired by deconstruction, he can possibly look at this wordplay, sun, and so on. Whereas what Terry Gilten is saying, that a critic who is inspired by structuralist theory will try to divide this entire story into some sets, some pairs. And what are those pairs? He can draw a diagram also. So for example, there is the forest and there is the city. This is one pairing. Another pairing is sun and sunlight and darkness, another pairing. The third important pairing can be father and son. Yet another pairing can be sun is high and pit is low. So this high and low pairing. So in other words, a critic who is inspired by I'm sorry, there is some break. I'm sorry, there is some break. Are you following me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Okay, you can hear. Okay, you can hear me. Okay.
Yes,
So I
Yes,
was
sir.
talking about a critic who is inspired by structuralist ideas, right? Structuralist ideas. Now, this critic will look for some sets of pairings: father, son, high, low, sunlight, darkness, pit, sky, and so on. Now, Terry Gilten also admit that this is not a great story, but this gives you some idea about the kind of method that structuralism can use. And what are the essential aspects of this method? And you can say that there are essentially three very important aspects of this method. One important thing is that, okay, one important thing about this method is that it is concerned with form. And here it completely ignores I'm going to mute you. Yeah, we were discussing Terry Eagleton's view about structuralism and how he narrates a very, say, ordinary, very funny story, and through that story he tries to discuss structuralist method. And there he divided the entire story into sets of pairings, and then those pairings are seen in terms of their relationship. A few things emerge from this. One important thing is that for a humanist critic, maybe that father is important, his characteristics are important. But here in structuralist method, father and his characteristics are not important, but rather this relationship which exists between this pair that is important. So if father is replaced by mother, and son is replaced by daughter, even if this relationship will hold. That means there is nothing intrinsic as far as father is concerned or son is concerned. In humanist criticism, father and his characteristics become important, but in this, probably this set of relationship is important. And it also reveals another aspect of a structuralist method, that it does not care for the content as such. Form is what matters. And here you can say the form of the story is the content. The form of the story, structuralism is so much interested in form that the form of the story becomes its content. So what is the theme of the story? Its form. What is the content of the story? Its form. So content as such is unimportant, but form becomes important, and form is all important. So the method is formal, but in a very, very radical manner, that its content is completely bracketed off, set aside, pushed to the margin, and form becomes important. What is the form of that story? And this another important thing is that this method is not evaluative, it is analytical. When I say the method is not evaluative, I'm saying that structuralism does not believe in this question of considering something great or ordinary. So this story is not an example of great literature. And Tolstoy's War and Peace or Anna Karenina, they are examples of great literature. But for the structuralist method, this does not matter. It can be applied to both an ordinary story or to Tolstoy's War and Peace. So it is basically a method which is analytical, not evaluative. It is not talking about something as being a great work of literature or something being an unimportant work of literature. No. So the method is formal in the sense that its content is its form. And the method is analytical, not evaluative. And the third important thing, and that is true about literary theory in general, that it deliberately ignores the most obvious meaning which is available. In other words, it does not trust common sense. It does not trust common sense. What I mean to say is that we have our common sense, and because of our common sense, we form certain opinions about certain things. But structuralism does not trust common sense. Now, this is a point in its favor also. We see people are killed because the common sense of the crowd tells them that, okay, it is fair to kill these people. People can be burned, or people can indulge in actual cases of witch hunting. Okay, somebody is considered a witch. Okay, this person should be killed, burned. Again, maybe a whole lot of people are acting on their common sense. So we see that we believe that our common sense is telling us something which is correct, which is important, but actually common sense can be a kind of ideology which we are following. Common sense can be a result of all those ideas which are around us. Common sense can be created, constructed. Common sense is maybe ideology masquerading as fair judgment. So common sense is not always something which tells us something very, very objectively. And you know that in different time periods, common sense has dictated something very different. I'm sorry, there is some disturbance today, but usually this disturbance is not there. So just bear with me. And this meeting is going to end very soon. It can go off any minute. So I was talking about three important aspects of structuralism as they are outlined by Terry Eagleton. One is that the method is formal. The second is that the method is analytical. And third is that the method does not trust the most commonsensical meaning. It does not trust the most obvious meaning. So three things: formal, it is all about form; analytical, it does not believe in the question of evaluation; and the third important thing, that it does not trust the most obvious. So that is Terry Gilten's analysis of structuralism. And the last point, that structuralism is all about form, or structuralism considers form very important, and so important that it pushes the content of the story to the background. This brings us to one very important school which flourished in Russia and which was also inspired by the ideas of Ferdinand de Saussure, and which also shares a very important relationship with structuralism, and this is Russian formalism. So Russian formalism and structuralism, they share a lot of ground, because Russian formalism also talks about form, structuralism also talks about form. And many of the thinkers associated with Russian formalism, they were greatly influenced by structuralism. And here you have one important name, and that name is the name of Roman Jakobson. And Roman Jakobson has a very interesting career. He was he was associated with Moscow Linguistic Circle, which studied languages. And its concerns were study of languages. Then he also was associated with Prague, that is Czech structuralism. He moved to Prague, Czechoslovakia, and where he was a leader of Prague structuralism. And then he migrated once more, and this time to United States of America. So Roman Jakobson provides the most important link between formalism and structuralism. Russian formalism, and of course formalism and structuralism in Prague, and structuralism proper. What I'll do now, I'll discuss Russian formalism, and then I'll pay some attention to Roman Jakobson. And here, especially students of fourth semester, I'm sorry, students of second semester, please note that Russian formalism is also there in your syllabus. So pay attention to everything that I'm going to discuss, and I'll discuss in some detail also. So as the term Russian formalism signifies, it is all about form. But what else is important about Russian formalism is that they raise some important questions. And what were those important questions? They wanted to know the laws which can make something literary. In other words, they raised this basic question. And the basic question was, what is literariness? What is literariness? And what constitutes literariness? Right? And here they try to find some answers to this question. What is literariness and what is literary? When Russian formalism appeared on the scene, at that time, or till that time, symbolism as a movement had achieved quite a bit with reference to form. What is important about symbolism? And let us just think about a poem which is symbolic in nature. If you think about a poem which is symbolic in nature, and if you analyze the language that is used in that poem, you'll say that, okay, here words possibly mean much more than they appear to be saying. So if there is an image which is used in a poem which is symbolic, then obviously that image means much more than its literal meaning. So if we read a poem like Tiger, Tiger Burning Bright, and tiger in that entire poem of Blake, then tiger is simply not a tiger. Tiger is also symbol, and when tiger is a symbol, so tiger acquires different meanings, and this word acquires different meanings. And similarly, if that poem has a particular kind of rhythm, then that rhythm is also meaningful. Maybe if we are reading Paradise Lost and we see all those similes, then those similes also become important. And this is something which we have learned over the years, that in any poem which uses symbols, then it is not words but also images, rhyme, rhythm, everything may contribute to meaning. So what we can safely say, that formalism also believed in stretching the language to its limit. That means, how can we stretch language beyond its everyday use? Language is used in day-to-day conversation, and the language of a poem is also not very different from that use. But in poem, the language is stretched further, 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 and it acquires new meanings. So this stretching of language was already a concern of symbolists, and this became an important concern of formalists. Then they were interested in this question, that what makes something literary, and they reached this conclusion that art always uses some devices, and this is something very important. For them, art was a matter of using some devices, some techniques, devices and techniques. And what are some of those devices?